So we are talking about our second lecture in the integumentary system, otherwise known as the skin, and it focuses on the dermis. This is our picture of the skin. Remember, we talked about the epidermis last time. Now we're going to focus on the dermis, which is this big middle section here with all of the interesting bits in it. So the dermis is the thickest layer of the skin, and it is the one that contains most of the accessory structures that we find in the skin. It forms the hides of animals, and I'm going to come back to this one a little bit, and I want to talk about it. And it is the tough, flexible layer that is 2 to 4 millimeters thick. So if you ever hear of like full grain leather or top grain leather, so coming back to this thing about hides of animals, so when they talk about full grain leather, they mean they are using both the epidermis and the dermis. They are using the full piece of skin. If they talk about top grain, what they've done is they've peeled the epidermis off and are sticking that to some kind of like man-made flexible fabric, because full grain leather is very, very expensive. And so being able to just like peel off the top layer with the epidermis, you can call it a real leather product without the expense of having to work with full leather. You can just apply it. You can just glue it essentially to some kind of man-made fabric, and there you have a cheaper alternative to real full grain leather. The dermis is thickest in the palms of our hands and the soles of our feet, and it is thinnest on the eyelid and on the back side of the ear. So we are going to talk about the layers of the dermis. There are 2 layers, the papillary layer, which is called the dermal papillae here, and then the reticular layer, which is what they're just calling the dermis. So those are our 2 layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So the papillary layer is wavy. If you noticed, it had those bumps all through it, and that allows for a greater surface area, so it allows for better radiation of heat and nourishment from those lower layers, for the lower layers of the epidermis, I should say. It has lots of nerve endings. This gives us space to allow those different nerve endings to like kind of be able to move a little bit and be displaced, and that gives us an increased sensitivity there. And this is just the top 1/5 of the dermis. It is not a very thick portion, whereas the reticular layer is the thickest part, and its biggest function is it conserves body heat. This is where most of those structures we talked about are present. And we have some specialized structures that we're going to talk about. So don't worry about writing these down at the moment. We're going to talk about those a little bit later, but those are just examples of some things we're going to see. So we find sweat glands in the dermis. We have 2 types. We have the eccrine and the apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine are more common, they're more prevalent, and they're activated by body temperature. So these are just, if you start to get hot, you will start to sweat from your eccrine sweat glands. These are not found in the margins of the lips, so along the edge of your lips, in your nail beds, in your toes and fingers, although you can have some mutations that do result in individuals having sweat glands underneath their fingernails. This can be dangerous because it can lead to infections and that kind of stuff. But it is something that can happen. The penis and the clitoris also do not have eccrine sweat glands, nor does the external auditory meatus, which you are probably more familiar with calling it the ear canal. We have 2 to 5 million eccrine sweat glands. Apocrine are emotional response sweat glands. So these are when you're feeling anxious or nervous. These are the ones that are going to activate. These are most closely found in things like the armpits and the pubic regions, and these do not activate until puberty. Also, the fluid here is slightly more viscous. That means it's a slightly thicker type of sweat than we see in the eccrine sweat glands. You are always sweating. You produce somewhere between 500 to 1,000 milliliters of sweat per day. So, and that's every single day, whether it's, winter or summer. That is a rough average. And just so you can get kind of a visual of this in your head. So a 2-liter bottle is 2,000 milliliters. So half of a 2-liter bottle of soda is what you're sweating each day. And the reason that you don't really notice that you're sweating all the time is that the sweat usually evaporates before you can actually feel it. And this is what we call insensible perspiration. You don't really start to feel the sweat collecting on your skin until you're starting to have more activity, or the general humidity prevents you from evaporating sweat. So if you remember anything about diffusion in chemistry, molecules do not want to move where there's a higher concentration. So if the relative humidity is really, really high, sweat becomes less effective because the water doesn't want to evaporate, because those molecules don't want to move into an already saturated space. And so you can start to feel the sweat collecting on your skin rather than evaporating. This also occurs when you're exercising. You increase the amount of sweat that you produce, which is why after you exercise a great deal, you start to feel that sweat accumulating on your skin. So just so you know where those sweat glands are, that's these. These are the sweat glands right here. You can see them. And these long tubes help the sweat be produced and kind of in a manageable rate be pushed up to the skin. And then there you can see the pore for the sweat gland. Sebaceous glands are associated with hair follicles. They're found at the base of a hair, and they don't secrete sweat. They secrete a substance called sebum, and sebum is much thicker than sweat, and it coats the hair. It's made of waxes and fatty acids and cholesterol. And sebum works to waterproof the skin. So it helps reinforce keratinization that we talked about before. It helps add to that process. And this is going to keep hair glossy, and it's going to help keep skin pliable. Men naturally make more sebaceous glands than women, and those also activate during puberty and are the leading cause of acne. So what happens is the sebaceous gland produces so much sebum, and it's thick and waxy, so it clogs the pore that the hair is growing out of, and bacteria can get trapped in there, and that's how you can start to get an infection going, and then you have the pus creation for a zit, that kind of thing, which is white blood cells that are self-destructing after fighting off the infection. So the sebaceous gland is this guy right here. He's actually labeled on this side of the diagram. You can see right there he's labeled, but this one's easier to see. So there's the sebaceous gland, and you can see there's the hair follicle, and he's going to secrete that sebum, and it's going to be like wicked up the hair so that it can flow out onto the skin. And this is how the pore, if it produces too much sebum, you can actually block the pore. Or you could block any other pores on the skin as well. Ceruminous glands are in the external auditory meatus. They are modified sweat glands, and instead of secreting sweat, they secrete cerumen, which is earwax. And it's just a protectorant. It protects against particulate getting into the ear canal. So it's just that thick wax that keeps anything that might blow into the ear from hitting the eardrum or any of the delicate structures inside the ear. Then you have tarsal glands. Tarsal glands are found at the margins of your eyes, so at the corners of your eyes. And they secrete a fluid that seals the eyelids during sleep so that you don't have your eyelid fall backwards and expose the eyeball during sleep. And if you've ever woken up with like an eye booger, or like with that dry crust in your eye, that's the tarsal fluid that has dried during the night. Hair, probably pretty familiar with this. It serves a protective function, and it decreases heat loss. So it actually, helps provide some covering in certain parts of the body in order to provide protection. And then it all, like in the eyelashes and eyebrows and nostrils, it prevents particulate from getting to those very sensitive structures. Specifically in the case of like your eyebrows and eyelashes, it protects the eye itself from particulate getting close. And then in the case of the nostrils, it helps filter out particulate before it could get to the very sensitive structures of the lungs. These are eyelash mites. So these are microscopic organisms that live in the pores of eyelashes, and they do not actually have like an anus. So they eat dead skin cells and bacteria until they die, and then they fall away. This is one of the major, they're fine. They don't really harm you unless you have a really intense infection of eyelash mites, because then what they can do is they can actually cause your eyelashes to fall out. So if you've ever wondered why makeup professionals advise you not to share makeup, this is the reason. Do not share makeup because you do not want to spread around things like eyelash mites or bacteria that live on the skin. So some more things about hair. The average person loses about 70 to 100 hairs per day, and that's absolutely normal. Anything over that might be considered a concern, but it kind of depends. Shedding rates can increase due to chemicals or radiation. Sometimes even surgery can cause hair to fall out. So you also see increased hair loss after pregnancy. And all of those things, as long as the hair starts to return, not a big deal. It's just when those hairs stay gone that we really start to get concerned. Hair growth starts at the bulb of the hair, and then the cells of a hair are actually keratin, just like the outer layer of the skin, but instead of being layered like we see in the skin, they're actually arranged into a tube. And so as those cells are keratinized, they're placed in that tube structure that we think of as hair. In fact, how densely packed the keratinized cells are kind of determines the texture of someone's hair. So if someone has really curly hair, they actually have, the keratin isn't as tightly packed, so it actually is more weightless, so it can actually form those curls. Someone with very straight hair, the keratin has very tightly packed against each other, so it's more weighted, and so because it has more weight to it, it hangs straight. And then we also use hair to retain heat. We have muscles at the base of each hair follicle that produce what we call goosebumps because they help stand the hair on end. So this is the erector pili muscle right here, and you can see it's attached to the hair follicle. So if this were to contract, it's going to pull this hair follicle like this up towards the epidermis, and it's going to cause this hair that's currently laying down to stand up straight. But when it does that, it's going to create a little bump on the surface of the skin, and that's where we get goosebumps from. Because if you think about, like, if you like flex your bicep, you see that bump where your bicep muscle is, and that is due to the muscle contracting and the muscle mass being in a shorter distance and causing that bump. And the same thing happens with erector pili muscles. Hair color is derived from melanin, and there are some different aspects of melanin that can happen, some variants to the way melanin is constructed that result in the different hair colors that we see. So melanin in itself is dark brown, and with the variants that we see with blonde hair, what has happened is a component of sulfur has been added to the melanin, which produces that blonde color. And then with red hair, a component of iron has been added to the melanin so that it actually oxidizes and produces that red coloration that we are so familiar with seeing. Gray hair is actually the result of a decline in tyrosinase, which is the enzyme that helps to make melanin. So what you're seeing with gray hair is actually just the coloration of keratin. Your fingernails are also made of keratin, which is why, like, the portions of your fingernails that are past the nail bed are kind of white in coloration. It's because you're just seeing the straight keratin with no other coloration. And when that's the case, we see it as gray hair. Now talking about nails. Again, just like with the skin in the epidermis, nails are tightly packed keratinized cells. And similar to the skin, they are arranged into plates. So they are layered like that. And their purpose is to protect the terminal ends of your fingers. So they are there to kind of spread out any impacts that might damage your fingertips. Like the underlying bone is what I mean. Like cause a break or damage to the underlying bone of your fingertip. So it spreads out that force so you don't end up breaking your fingertips all the time. So if you move later in your notes, you will find a nail picture. So this is the nail picture that you can use to actually label your diagram. You have the nail plate. You also have the nail fold. The lunula is that like half moon shape at the base of your fingernail. The nail root is actually back underneath the skin. And this is part of the reason why if you have your nails done, you don't necessarily want them to push back your cuticles. That's another name for the epiconium, is the cuticle. They'll push back the skin to show more nail. But one of the things that can happen is you can actually get infection underneath the epicynum or the cuticle, and you can actually damage the nail bed because then you get an infection introduced there. So if you like to have your nails done, I highly recommend asking them not to push your cuticles back because you don't want to possibly have infection introduced there. And then just like with the hair, where we saw the hair bulb, you have the nail matrix here. And then the hyponychia is the skin underneath the nail. And then just wrapping up the layers of the skin with the hypodermis. So we have the epidermis is the outermost layer, we have the dermis, which is the middle layer, and then we have the hypodermis, which is the underneath layer. This is where we have large blood vessels. So if you've ever had to have blood drawn, this is where they're going to get that blood from. They're going to feel for the blood vessel in your hypodermis. This is much thicker than the epidermis, but it's usually not as thick as the dermis. It's loaded with adipose tissue, and it's really there for insulation and protection. And so here is our lovely diagram of the skin. This is kind of a chance for you to kind of get all of the different labeling down that you need to in order to make sure you have a good idea of what's going on. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we have kind of skimmed over. Specifically, I want to talk a lot about some of these structures that we see. So like we've talked about the pore of the sweat gland, and we've talked about the layers of the epidermis, but I want to talk a little bit about the like different like nerves that we see running through the skin here. So we have some different things labeled here, and there's one on here that I want to make sure I also add. So starting on this side, we have a free nerve ending. So the free nerve ending, if you look, it runs into the papillary layer right there, and you can actually see it's just kind of sitting all on its own with just like a free nerve. The free nerve ending, its main role is to detect heat and pain. So its job is to just like, it's a thermoreceptor, so it responds to changes in temperature, and it also responds to pain. Then we have the Messners. If you look, the Messner's is this gray circle right here, and I just want to kind of contrast it to the free nerve ending, which is just like a single nerve strand just standing on its end right here in the papillary layer, whereas this is a corpuscle, which is a like oval shaped structure that acts as a sensory. And this is to detect delicate pressure and touch. And then we have the Krauss's end bulb. Krauss's end bulb is for cold sensation. So this detects decreases in temperature. And then this structure right here is not labeled, but I want you to add it to your notes. This is a Pacinian. This is here to feel deep pressure. So this is how we sense really deep, firm touch. And then Ruffini, right here in the middle of the skin, that is to sense skin stretching. So when you feel that kind of like tension in your skin, that's being relayed by Ruffini corpuscles. So I just wanted to make sure I hit on those. Each of these are things that you probably should be familiar with. So you have sensory nerves. You can see how those are running away from our different sensory structures. We also have autonomic nerves that are going to lead to things like our erector pili or our blood vessels in order to regulate the flow of blood to the skin. We have the subcutaneous fatty tissue, which is the adipose tissue that we are all familiar with. The hair root is the blood supply to the hair. So the hair bulb is the actual like outside coating of the hair. It's like the sac that the hair sits in, whereas the hair root is the blood supply. You have arteries and veins. I would prefer you refer to the subcutaneous tissue as the hypodermis, but if you use subcutaneous tissue, I won't care. But I find it easier to remember epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis, but that is purely up to you. So that should get you this diagram all filled in. And that will be where this lecture ends. We're going to come back with our next lesson to talk about skin disorders and things like that.